Hello everyone, my name is Ahmad Aghajani, PhD student at Reveal Research Group at Software Institute from Università della Svizzera Italiana. Software documentation issues like outdated or incorrect content have become an inevitable part of software developers' life. Last year, we presented a research study focusing on such issues. In summary, we manually inspected a large number of artifacts discussing software documentation issues from different data sources. And based on that, we built a detailed taxonomy of documentation issues composed of 162 different issue types, followed by an in-depth discussion of issues, their concrete examples, and actionable suggestions to address them. Although our taxonomy is comprehensive, it is too detailed to be used by other researchers and practitioners, and it's not validated by software professionals. This paper aims to address these issues. Particularly in this work, we revisited our taxonomy and compressed it by keeping key issue types. Then, in collaboration with ABB Corporation, we conducted two surveys aiming at answering the following two research questions. First, understanding documentation issues which are relevant to practitioners. Answering this research question can guide researchers in the development of techniques and tools aimed at identifying and possibly fixing issues considered important by practitioners. With our second research question, we aim to understand the types of software documentation, like code comments, release notes, that are considered useful by practitioners when performing a specific software-related activity, like code refactoring or program debugging. This information is essential in the design of software documentation recommender systems whose goal is to automatically generate documentation customized for a given task. Starting with the first item in our agenda, to limit the number of documentation issue types, first we organized our taxonomy into three parts. Then we merged together documentation issues that are very similar and share the same parent category. As a result of this process, we ended up with only 51 documentation issues, from originally 162. This is the new set of issues. First group refers to problems with the documentation content, like what is written in the documentation. Second group relates to how documentation is written or organized. And lastly, the third one groups issues linked to documentation process or tools. Moving on to our first research question, we conducted a survey with 78 software professionals, mostly employed by ABB company. The survey basically asked participants to select the documentation issues which are more relevant to them, or issues encountered more frequently. Based on the collected responses, in the paper we report the percentage of participants that considered an issue as important, how frequently participants face them, common solutions adopted or suggested by practitioners, whether they affect documentation readers or writers or both, an in-depth discussion of interesting cases shared by practitioners, and finally, discussion of possible future research directions. As an example of our discussions, let's take a look at second group of issues related to the way documentation content is written or organized. We found documentation clarity is the issue perceived as most important by practitioners as it affects them in many ways. Taking documentation users and their needs into consideration when writing documentation, verifying documentation by someone with little domain knowledge, and including and highlighting essential information items in documentation were among proposed solutions shared by practitioners. In this space, future research can be devoted to automatic testing of software documentation and understanding information elements which are essential in each type of documentation. In fact, our second research question is toward these latter directions. Our second research question aims at understanding usefulness of different types of documentation and their elements when performing a specific software-related activity. For that, we conducted a second survey with 68 software professionals. Given a random documentation type like code comment, participants were asked to answer three basic questions. In which task does this type of documentation come in handy? What is the rationale behind their choice? And finally, which elements make it particularly useful? We answered this research question by analyzing a heat map depicting the percentage of participants who considered each documentation type being useful in different tasks. The dark spots in the chart indicates that high percentage of participants consider the documentation is useful for that task. Looking at the chart, the most noticeable message here is that practitioners do not perceive all documentation types as useful for different tasks. In addition to reporting useful types of documentation in different tasks, as part of the paper, we discussed the reasons provided by practitioners to explain why a documentation type is useful during a specific task. And for each documentation type, we report the information elements listed as particularly useful. Let's take a look at one example. A quick glance at the chart, we found that code comments are perceived useful mostly for two quite related tasks, namely software debugging and program comprehension. This confirms that the context is essential in the documentation recommender systems aimed at automatically generating documentation. When we asked participants about their choice, participants stressed code comments can communicate information that is not evident in the code, which is essential for those who join the project at later stages. Participants also highlighted the fundamental role of parameters description and developers' assumption in software debugging as the most useful elements within code comments. To wrap up, in this paper we revisited our last year's work and refined our documentation issues taxonomy to make it more usable by externals. Then we investigated the types of issues which are relevant to developers, and we reported common solutions proposed by practitioners and possible future research directions in this space. And finally, we investigated the type of documentation and its elements which are useful in specific software development tasks, as well as the rationale behind such choices. Our results can be leveraged in the development of future software recommender systems aimed at generating software documentation. Thank you for your attention.